a Christian should not grieve when another Christian died. But the truth is, what Solomon said about times, has not changed. There is a time to mourn. There was a Christian counselor talking to a group of preachers when I was in Washington about grief. And one thing he said struck me. He said something to this effect: to grieve or not to grieve is not the question, because all of us grieve. It is a pay me now or pay me later proposition. Because God created us with emotions, and grieving is an emotional response to a loss. And you and I will grieve the loss of anything that we value, even not a person. But since grief is an emotional response, and emotions are not logical, grief doesn't always look the same. And sometimes it even looks like the opposite of what it is. So it's futile to attempt to avoid grief, and possibly even dangerous. You will only be denying it, and sooner or later you'll have some sort of a breakdown, or it will break through in you at least. It may be years later. And you're better off to admit, therefore, your grief closer to when the loss occurs. But there is a healthy grieving and an unhealthy grieving, and we do have some control over how we grieve. We don't have to let grief destroy us, and we can learn the most important lesson of all from grief. You see, grief is really a lesson in reality. In the world we live in, loss is a reality. We have that saying, every good thing comes to an end. Of course, so does every bad thing, which we sometimes fail to acknowledge. But you and I aren't going to make it through this world without losing something that we value highly, and that is a lesson that we must learn. If we don't, then we will put all of our energy and resources, everything we have, into getting things that we don't want to lose, and trying to keep those things, from being lost. And so then we're going to, in the end, lose everything. All right? But there is only one good thing that does not come to an end, and that is life in Christ. And that is an altogether different reality from the reality of this world. This reality does not mean that the reality of this world is no longer real. We will still lose loved ones, and we'll lose jobs, and we'll lose things, and we will still grieve those losses. But the difference is that we will not be threatened by them, because we value those people and those things as gifts rather than entitlements. But we will not have invested in them. We will have sold everything and invested in what Jesus called in one parable the pearl of great price. We put it into one guaranteed investment program. And this makes all the difference between life in Christ compared to life without Christ. And the difference really is all because of what happened in John chapter 20, which is where we're going to spend most of our time this morning. But first of all, look back at John 16, where Jesus was talking to his disciples about his own death before it occurred. And he had said that he would be leaving them and then returning. Now, if I asked any of you what he meant by that, you'd probably say, well, his death and resurrection, of course. But his disciples, his closest friends, didn't understand at all. But it wasn't because they were dumb or even thick-headed. If I said, in a little while you'll see me no more, and then in a little while you'll see me, what would you think? Well, you'd think he's going on another one of his trips, right? But resurrection was no more a known reality to Jesus' disciples than it is to you. And so the only reality they knew at this time was the reality of this world. So look at what they said when he said he was going to be leaving and then returning. Jesus saw that they wanted to ask him about this. So he said to them, are you asking one another what I meant when I said, in a little while you'll see me no more, and then after a little while you will see me? I tell you the truth, you will weep and mourn. While the world rejoices, you will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come, but when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. So with you. Now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. Now, notice that Jesus didn't say that their joy would outweigh their grief. He didn't say that their joy would be so great that they'd forget their sorrow. He didn't even say that the grief would just go away when the joy came. He said the grief would turn to joy. I take that to mean that the grief will itself become joy. The beast will be transformed into beauty. It will be a metamorphosis, like a caterpillar to a butterfly. So the pain of childbirth will become the joy of a baby. So we're going to try to get into the minds of and hearts of Jesus' followers now as we look at what happened. In chapters 18 and 19 that we looked at last week, the worst thing that they could ever imagine has happened. At least that's within their understanding what has happened. And they had invested everything that they had in Jesus, all of their time and money, but most of all, their hopes. They had no alternate plan if Jesus failed. There was no plan B to move on to. But it wasn't only that, they actually loved this man. Never before had they been made to feel that they had such great value. Never before had they felt that they could make a difference. You'd think that being around someone who seemed absolutely flawless would give you an inferiority complex, but he had the opposite effect on them. And they considered him to be their Lord in the sense that they had made themselves slaves to him. Yet, even though they called him master, he called them friends. He declared his own love for them when he said this, "Greater love has no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends. I no longer call you servants." Remember back in John 15. Now, he has lost his life, and they still have theirs, but they don't really see that they've accomplished anything. What has come from this? The Romans are still in power. The chief priests are a sham. They're just a bunch of politicians feathering their own nests. They have given up the businesses that they had, their lives basically. They have little or no life to go back to. And it's not that it was a total shock. They had always known that there was a great risk. They had expected to be fighting a war. And they knew that, in war, people die. And they knew that there were some who were out to kill Jesus. In fact, Thomas, the pessimist, was now really in an I told you so position. He had seen it coming. Look back at John 11. Jesus has received word that his friend Lazarus is sick, remember? But they had stayed up in Galilee, a long way from Lazarus, 2 more days after they knew that Lazarus was very sick and Lazarus died. And then Jesus says, let's go to Judea. Look at what Thomas says back in chapter 11. But Rabbi, they said, well, this wasn't Thomas, but this was them. A short while ago, the Jews tried to stone you, and yet you are going back there? Well, he explains that Lazarus has died, and then look what Thomas says. Then Thomas, called Didymus, said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us go also, that we may die with him." Okay, so Thomas, the pessimist, can now say, "I told you so," but it's a little like what Ed said, he wanted on his gravestone at one point, he wanted to put on his gravestone, "I told you I was sick." You would have the last word if you put that on your gravestone. It's not really something you can get a lot of joy out at that point, but I doubt if Thomas got any joy out of having been right when they had taken off for Jerusalem. Being a pessimist, his grief may actually be the deepest of all. Hoping for the best is not in his nature. And in chapter 20, we'll see that he certainly isn't ready to believe that the best has happened, even when he is told that it has. So let's go to chapter 20 now. And when I say that Thomas was a pessimist, don't think that I mean to criticize Thomas, at least not as compared to anyone else. That was a pretty brave statement, actually. Let's go, even that we may die with him. But in chapter 20, we'll see that it takes different things to bring faith in different people. Yet Jesus doesn't refuse or fail to provide what each party, each different type of person needs before they can believe. God made each of us as unique individuals, and he doesn't punish us for being unique. So he doesn't offer the same evidence to Shirley that he does to Joyce. Shirley and Joyce are different, a little bit different, but not different in a bad way, different from each other. Okay, and what works for Shirley might not work for Joyce, and vice versa. And yes, we all have the same Bible, but we haven't all been exposed to the same things in it in exactly the same way. And we've grown up with different parents whose beliefs and lives were different, and God has done different things for each of us in our own lives. But we do have one thing in common. We all need joy. And God wants us to have joy. And there's one thing that we must all do in order to have joy. We must believe. We must believe that Jesus did rise from the dead. We must believe that he overcame death once and for all. We must believe that we have nothing to fear as long as we put our faith and trust in him. The fact is that joy is a product of faith. Jesus' resurrection will not result in a bit of joy for you unless you believe that it happened. Isn't that obvious? If there were a cure discovered for every cancer, would that discovery cure every victim of cancer? Not unless they took the cure. So as terrific as it would be for all of those who did get it, this cure wouldn't bring an ounce of joy to anyone who didn't believe in it enough to take the cure. So the question is, what will it take for you to have a faith that produces joy? Now, let's see what it took for the different people who had known Jesus personally. So we're going to go now to John chapter 20 and begin at verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. Now this is John speaking of himself in the third person. So whenever there's an unnamed disciple, it's John who's writing. Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and she said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him." So Peter and the other disciples started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple, John, outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Is that as far as I wanted to go? Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went inside. He saw and believed. So, for some of us, belief comes actually pretty easily. John sort of didn't need much evidence. He only needed a little verification. Jesus had said he would rise from the dead, and even though John, like all the others, didn't understand that it had to be that way, didn't really even believe that it was going to happen, he believed when he saw a little evidence. It certainly wasn't very strong evidence. I mean, Peter didn't believe because of the empty tomb. Neither did Mary Magdalene. And so John is a lot like some of us who were raised by parents who taught us about God from day one. Not all of us are quite alike in the way we develop, even if our parents did believe. But a basic faith has come easily for many of us. And that faith, even though it came through relatively little struggle, has provided us with a source of joy that is always there. And this kind of faith has kept a lot of us out of the tangled mass of trouble that sin typically causes, or always causes. Addictions are not unseen, but they're far less common. I was raised, in a community where drinking was, pretty much forbidden. It was even a dry county. And so there was little temptation for that. And even though other drugs came into the county, as well as some people still went out of the county to drink, self-discipline was not as difficult. And now, freedom from all of that mess might seem like a guarantee of happiness, but it really isn't. The absence of trouble is not joy. Joy does come more easily maybe when you start nearer to a middle line rather than from some point way below the line, and that's a blessing. But let me say that struggle will come regardless of how you're raised, and grief will come even for those who had a great childhood. It's just a part of life. But there are blessings that come with the kind of faith that takes a little more as well. So faith might come easily for you, but faith might need something personal for you. See, Mary Magdalene didn't draw the same conclusion as John when she saw the empty tomb. Read with me beginning in verse 10. Then the disciples went back to their homes. That seems kind of abrupt, but I don't think there was nothing that happened. But when they went back to their homes, Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white, seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They've taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they put him." At this, they turned around and saw Jesus standing, or she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't realize it was Jesus. "Woman," he said, "why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned toward him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni." Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I've not yet returned to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I'm returning to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. Now, is it reading too much into this to suggest that Jesus didn't appear to John because he didn't need to appear to him, but that he appeared to Mary because she did need that? I believe there's something to that. And notice that Jesus doesn't chastise her and say, "Why can't you be more like John?" I mean, you don't see him blubbering all over the place. If you weren't so slow to believe, then you'd save yourself a lot of grief. Well, there's also something here that is missing in John's reaction, though. It's drama. There's a lot of excitement in Mary's reaction, where there's no visible excitement at all in John's case. I'm not saying he wasn't excited, but this too seems to generally correspond to my own experience, in coming to faith, as compared to the experience of Christians who were rescued, from the depths of despair. I mean, often there is a lot more exuberance in their religion. Some of it, I'm sure, is personality, but how is personality developed? It's partly affected by the home and environment where it grew. I think of our friend Tori back in Montana. She grew up in a home with a Christian man who would take them to Bible studies where he was teaching people about Christ and what it took to become a Christian, and then he was abusing his children at home. And she grew up to rebel against that, went into the sort of the hippie lifestyle, the drug culture, and then she came back with her husband, who had been, sort of the same background, and had left, Christ with her, But when they came back, I mean, she became the encourager of the whole church. So isn't it often true that those who come to Christ as adults, or later on, not growing up in the church, generally have more enthusiasm to share even the good news than those who were brought up to live as Christians? See, it's not always true, but it's so often true that, it's a common observation. Well, the Apostle Paul is another example of one who needed a more personal experience. And we don't know of anyone else who received this special attention after Jesus ascended into heaven. Jesus appeared to him personally. Now, I don't question the depth and value of John's convictions at all. I mean, this gospel, what we've been going through, is a powerful example of John's faith and the joy that resulted from that faith. But who seems to have been the more active in the spread of the church? Was it John, who grew up and believed in Jesus from the beginning? Or is it Paul, the one who began as a persecutor and Jesus appeared to him personally? And Paul was the one who preached all over the known world. So let me make it clear that I do not believe that the Bible promises or even suggests that Jesus will personally appear to you or to anyone today. John's main reason for writing this book seems to be actually for that very reason. Jesus isn't appearing anymore. And those who have seen him personally are dying off. We'll see that at the end of our lesson this morning. But does Jesus change lives anymore? Was he at the time that John was writing? Is he now? Obviously he is. He makes dramatic changes where dramatic changes are needed. And when that happens, we get to see an especially exuberant kind of joy. And so maybe that's you, or maybe it could be you. Maybe you're not there yet. It doesn't devalue the joy of someone like me or anyone else any more than Paul's type of joy devalued John's. So there are those who have come to faith easily, and there are those who might need something personal, and then there are those who actually have to overcome some serious doubts. And so faith might need to overcome some serious doubts in you. This is where Thomas was. John only needed a nudge to believe. He must have tended toward believing even before there was any evidence. Mary probably wanted to believe and was open to believe. She probably wouldn't have disputed someone else's story if Jesus had appeared first to them. Thomas, on the other hand, is basically skeptical. He doesn't even accept the testimony of the whole group of disciples. Look at verse 19. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." That's probably just the regular greeting, shalom, which is the Jewish greeting now. So after he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. And again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone his sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." Now Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it." Now, what would you do with a Thomas? We might tend to get a little frustrated, don't you think? Well, if you're going to be that way, what are you hanging around here for anyway? Maybe you'd be better off to be with your own kind. Why don't you just join up with the Sadducees? They don't believe in angels or spirits or life after death, so sounds to us like you'd feel right at home with them. Yeah. Well, Jesus had every right to say that himself. But look as we continue. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." So Jesus had every right to say, "Look, Thomas, I'm not showing you any favors. If you can't believe on the basis of what everyone else has, just forget it." But what he said was, "Put your finger here in the holes in my hands. Feel my side where the spear went in." Now, yes, when Jesus says stop doubting and believe, there's a rebuke in those words. But considering the circumstances, seems like a rather mild rebuke to me. See, it did take more to reach a skeptic than it took to reach John, who was more of a romantic. But the skeptics need God as much as the romantics, and they have special things to offer as well when they overcome that skepticism. I can't help but think of C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was a skeptic who became a Christian, and he wrote a book about his journey to faith, and he called it Surprised by Joy. C.S. Lewis's writings have become a great source of insight. What in the world is going on here? Let's go back to the slideshow. C.S. Lewis's writings have become a great source of insight and depth, probably actually the most published author of all, Christian author, and certainly was the most popular Christian writer of his time, and most of his books are still being printed and sold today and read and enjoyed. Another skeptic who comes to mind, to my mind, is John Clayton. John Clayton was a young man who was active in a young atheist organization associated with Madalyn Murray O'Hair, who was, led the charge to get prayer out of schools and all of the other things that atheists try to get removed from our society that remind us of our faith. And John, one Sunday, when he went to college, here's how it unfolded as he explains it. He went to college and he was going to write a book. And his book was going to be titled All the Stupidity of the Bible. Well, John had never read the Bible. And so he decided, well, I guess maybe I better read it so that I can find all the stupid things I'm going to write about. And as he read it, he realized, all of the stupid things that the atheists have been teaching me are so stupid, really aren't at all what they're saying. This isn't really a stupid book at all. And then he walked into the study of the Church of Christ in Indianapolis, where a friend of mine's dad was preaching at the time. And he became a Christian, and John then became a man who had a great ministry. He was a science teacher in Indiana, was a science teacher of the year many times, but he had an extensive ministry, still has it, going out and teaching people what it really, what science really means and how science and the Bible don't really conflict at all. And it's been a big help, not just to people who didn't have a hard time believing, but people who are struggling in the way that he did. So neither C.S. Lewis nor John Clayton, would likely have provided all of what they bring to others if they hadn't been skeptics. And if they hadn't thought they had to know it all, So like Thomas, they were finally humbled as they came to faith, but their skeptical nature was usable in God's service, and God had the patience to go just a step further toward them. So, I've shared in the joy of their faith because it means a lot to me when I read what they write about and hear their journey and hear their insights. And that kind of joy to me seems like a really rich joy, maybe the richest of all. So, what would you expect to hear in a lesson about joy? You might expect more about Mary's kind of joy, the enthusiasm, the overjoyed reaction of Mary and of the whole group of his disciples when Jesus finally appears among them. But John said just as much about his own story, which was a little less exuberant, and that of Thomas, which, who struggled coming to that joy. So maybe that's because we need all kinds of joy. So what did it take for you to believe, or what will it take for you to believe? Well, that's what you need if you want to be more joyful, whatever it will take. You don't need techniques or advice. Joy is not something that you do. Joy is something that you have, and it comes to you when you believe. It becomes richer or stronger when your faith grows. Well, how can your faith grow? Well, the best way is simply to feed it, doing what we're doing this morning. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. That's what Jesus said. And then John says, Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So John was writing at a time when he was in prison, the last of the living apostles, maybe one of the last who had actually seen Jesus. People were getting worried. Christians were wondering, we thought he was going to come right away. Did he really do what these guys said that he did? And so John wrote this under those special circumstances for them and for us, that by believing we may have life in his name. So the question for all of us is, do you have or do you want life without limits? And that's what we're going to actually sing about here. So let's stand together. If there's something you want to bring to us that you are struggling with, we want to know about it. If we can help, whether you bring it to us publicly or privately, please don't hold back, because you need what God wants you to have. Let's stand.